Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So today we're going to go through the book of Numbers, and this is the fourth book of the law, or the Pentateuch, whichever you prefer. And originally, the book of Numbers had the Hebrew title of In the Wilderness. Now that's because in verse 1, it starts out by saying, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai." But we have the English title of Numbers because we go through really the genealogy. So that's what it starts out with. So as a basic overview of Numbers, we need to connect it with the book of Exodus, which is the previous book. So first of all, Exodus ended with Moses outside the tabernacle that was set up with all the furniture, but he was unable to enter. In Exodus 40, 34 and 35, it says, "Then the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So Moses wasn't able to enter because the laws that they learned in the book of Leviticus needed to apply. So here we see in Leviticus, Moses, it said, was spoken to outside of the tabernacle by God, whose presence was in the tabernacle. So in Leviticus, it starts out by saying, "Now the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord," and then it goes on. So in Exodus, he was outside, Moses was. In Leviticus, the Lord spoke to him from inside the tabernacle. And then finally, we get here in Numbers. Let me slide this over here. And it begins with Moses now in the tabernacle, spoken to by God, whose presence was in the tabernacle, as it says here in Numbers 1, verse 1. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle." So the laws in Leviticus took effect. They were now being sanctified and able to be in God's presence in the book of Numbers. So this now, the result of Moses and Israel following the laws from Leviticus, so they can come into God's presence in the tabernacle and not offend God or harm themselves by failing to follow the procedures required for purity, which were all learned in the book of Leviticus. So let's look at some key people in the book of Numbers. So first of all, we have Moses, then Aaron, his brother. We have Miriam, Moses' sister. And then there's a mixed multitude. We'll get to those in chapter 11, which would be a combination of not only perhaps Jews and half-Jews, but also Egyptians that left Egypt with Israel. We have Joshua, who was Moses' assistant. He was one of the faithful spies. We saw him earlier, and he kind of came to light in the book of Exodus, and then now we'll see him again importantly in Numbers. Caleb, also a faithful spy. We'll find both him and Joshua are only 2 out of the 12 sent into the land of Canaan as spies come out with faith. Korah, who was a Levite, he was within the Levitical tribe, though not in Aaron's line. He had some issues with Moses and Aaron and the position that he really wanted for himself. So we'll see what happens there. Sihon, king of Heshbon, important figure. We'll get to him in chapter 21, along with Og, the king of Bashan, very large man. And then Balak, the king of Moab. He also plays into what Israel does near the end of their wilderness wandering. And then Balaam, who is the false pagan prophet that Balak, the king of Moab, hires to curse Israel. And so, in the overview of Numbers, I think it's easiest to divide it out by locations. There's three main locations within the book of Numbers. And first, we have Mount Sinai. That's where they start out. So on the map here, you see Mount Sinai is toward the bottom, and this is where Israel lands after they come out of Egypt, after they cross the Red Sea. Now, they journey, and that takes us actually halfway through chapter 10 to chapter 12. They go on a journey through the wilderness, they start moving, and then they end up in the wilderness of Paran. And then that's kind of roughly halfway, a little less, to the plains of Moab, where they end up crossing actually into the land of Canaan. So that's kind of their second stopping spot, if you will. And then they journey, chapter 20 and 21, and finally they reach the plains of Moab in chapter 22. And you see up in the top right there, that's where they will sit basically until they actually enter into the promised land. So first, this Mount Sinai location that they are at, and this is really, if you think about the end of the book of Exodus, where they get the law, it starts out with the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. They are sitting at Mount Sinai all the way through from like chapter 19 up until right through Leviticus into Numbers chapter 10, where they start to move. So, first of all, the book starts out and gets its name because the people are numbered. They take a census. And then they move into setting the order of the camp with the ark. We get the ark is really the place for God's presence, and it will be at the center, and then the tribes will be around it. So we see kind of this layout where in the middle of all the tribes, you have the tabernacle set up that was built in the book of Exodus, and then you have the Levitical tribe that is in the center with the tabernacle, and then all the other tribes, they encamp around the tabernacle, the Levites being closely connected to the tabernacle because that's where they serve. So it's always at the center, and God's presence is in the ark, in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies at the center. And that's kind of a picture of what it may look like as the tribes are gathered around it. You see there in the upper right. And then the marching order is set for when they travel. So here the ark leads. Judah leads out of all the tribes, is the principal tribe and the head tribe. And then you see how there's a division. You have the tabernacle materials behind Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Gershom and Merari are the families that really manage that. And then you can see the other tribes, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Then the tabernacle furniture with the Kohathites, they carry them, and then the other tribes trailing. So this is how they would march when they moved. Everything was orderly, God's presence in the ark, either in their center or leading as they moved. So the priests and the people then were sanctified through various purification laws for their journey to the promised land. So this is really chapter 1 through 10, and then they start to move. So then the journeying takes place. So 3 days into the journey, the people complain, and then Moses intercedes for them. We see that this is a recurring thing where Moses does intercession for the people. A great example, type of Christ, we see in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. Jesus is our high priest interceding for us. Moses does it because he realizes that the commitment that God has made, the unconditional covenant through Abraham, is important not only in reference to God fulfilling his promises in the redemptive plan that he has, that he's bringing through these people, promised to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, but also realizing that these people are representing God. So Moses wants that to be the best as possible. Now, in chapter 12, we have Miriam and Aaron. They oppose Moses by challenging his leadership. Miriam is judged with leprosy, indicating that she was probably the leader in this challenge. And then again, Moses intercedes for her. They need to wait while she's outside the camp to go through the purification ritual so she's clean of her leprosy, and then they continue to move. And then Israel moves to the wilderness of Paran. So then, while they're there, in chapter 12, we have the 12 spies. I'm sorry, chapter 13, we have the 12 spies scout out the land. And unfortunately, 10 of them bring a disheartening report. So this results in 40 years of wandering in the wilderness as a judgment on the parents from everybody that's 20 years old and up, but yet the children will go in. Now, this is seen in chapter 13. There's a major problem that results from this. Not only does the majority of Israel end up dying in the wilderness, but part of the complaint is that if they go into the land because they were in unbelief and didn't trust God to be able to take care of the giants, they said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. But the fact that they didn't trust God to go in, complaining that actually their children would be a prey to these giants in the land and the people in the land, God said, well, that's fine. I'll actually bring your children in, the ones that you're concerned about. So that didn't hold a lot of water. Then they wanted to make a leader, get rid of Moses, make another leader, and go back to Egypt, which God was not real thrilled with. So that resulted in the 40 years of wandering. He basically let them have what they wanted. It's a tremendous lesson for us in the book of Numbers, that God will allow us to have what we want, not always in the good way, and that, in a sense, is part of a chastisement on our part. So there was a rebellion. They wanted to replace Moses in chapter 14 and return to Egypt again. Third time here, Moses intercedes. Chapter 16, we have Korah's rebellion. Apparently, Korah didn't learn much from Miriam and Aaron, but he decided to gain all the leadership throughout Israel and convince them to kind of fight his battle. Korah had a personal issue with God. He was upset that God didn't call him to be Moses and give him that position. So he basically, instead of going to God, he gathered leaders from Israel, kind of got a posse, if you will, convinced them that he should have Moses' position, that why should Moses and Aaron have that? They're no better than anybody else, ignoring God's call and actually misunderstanding and thinking that he could make his own call to the priesthood, which this is a selection that's made by God. So Korah learns that that's not the way to go. Moses gathers everybody together, says, look, if Korah and his people, if they die of an old age, then God isn't speaking through me. However, if something new happens and something different, the ground opens up and all these people get swallowed up into the ground, then it closes up, well, then God's speaking through me, and that's exactly what happened. And this is an indication of the miraculous verification of what Moses had as a position. So it wasn't just that Moses was speaking for God. When Moses spoke, there were signs that accompanied his speaking. This is unparalleled with any other religious book in human history, where God would consistently confirm what his speakers were doing. So, and that they were speaking for him. Chapter 17, there was a rod given, one from each of the the tribes, and this demonstrated where Aaron's rod budded the next morning uh, at the entrance of the tabernacle, that God had selected Aaron's line to offer sacrifice, um, life coming from the death, an indication of resurrection. Again, this is all tied into the priesthood type of Christ, um, important for the New Testament too. And then finally in 18 and 19, the purification with the red heifer. There was a lot of people that were going to be dying in the wilderness, and the red heifer gave them the opportunity to basically mix together with water this red heifer sacrifice, so that they could have a ceremonial cleansing and continue to move through the wilderness. There was 2 to 3 million people, and many of them were going to be dying over the course of 40 years. This would be like daily funeral services. So in having to deal with that, instead of having to put people outside of the camp and have them ceremonially unclean, the red heifer enabled them to continue to bury people and move along through the wilderness journeyings through that 40-year march. So we see now, after chapter 19, chapter 20 and 21, they journey on. The people complain again. They fail to trust God, and then Moses now fails to trust God in chapter 20. And God told him to just speak to the rock and he would give them water. They were thirsty. Moses went up, and not only did he strike the rock, but he said, do we have to do this? In other words, Moses put himself kind of in God's position and misrepresented God to the people, his own unbelief and frustration coming out with striking the rock. But the problem is that the people needed water, and God was not angry at them. God was supplying the water through the rock. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10, the rock was Christ. So God was giving them what they needed. He was giving them water for their lives. They needed to survive. And this rock also served as a type. Earlier in Exodus, Moses was told to strike the rock. He struck it and water come out. Now this is the time that he was only supposed to speak to the rock. And again, connecting it to the cross of Christ, initially Jesus was struck on the cross and crucified, never to be crucified again, lives forever to make intercession for us, as Hebrews tells us. And so the second time for salvation, we just speak. We just need to believe in Jesus Christ. We speak to him and confess to him that we believe. And so this was the type. Moses messed that up. And again, from a typology standpoint, the law can never bring you into the victory and promises of God. That's the idea behind it here. So Moses was also now restricted from entering into the promised land, like the unbelieving generation. He fell into the same failure. The people again complain. Slide over here. And they despise the manna that God has given them. God judges them with a plague. Moses intercedes, and he makes a brass serpent, obeying God's instructions. So again, Jesus talked about this: as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up from the earth, in John chapter 3. Now, this is, again, an important type. God was actually made to use something that was a reference to judgment as a form of healing for these people. So they were dying of a plague from poisonous snakes. Moses made a snake of brass. God told him to put it up on a pole. And it says, as they looked to that serpent, just by faith looking at it, they would be healed. And it's the same with Christ. There's nothing that you can do to save yourself. It's just believing in Jesus, because he did all the work. And God laid our sin on him. And in him, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5, he became sin that we may become the righteousness of God in him. So him becoming sin, actually, God used that as the means of actually producing our healing, spiritually in that sense, um, our salvation. And this is what's brought out in reality for the type we see back in this serpent on this brass serpent on the pole. And then there's the defeat of King Sihon and Og as they were moving through the wilderness. They came upon them. Um, they were both very powerful nations. Og was like 13 feet tall. He had an enormous metal bed to support him. It talks about it. Sihon also uh, difficult uh, enemy to be able to defeat, but God was with Israel and defeated both of them. So they hit the plains of Moab, ready to go in, the last chapters of Numbers. And so we get introduced, chapter 22 to 24, to this interesting guy named um, Balaam. So Balak, the king of Moab, who had lost battles to both Sihon and Og, said, you know, this nation is coming up and they're probably going to attack us. So what he did was he got this guy Balaam, who was a false prophet, to come and curse Israel. So Balaam tries to curse Israel. He actually gets paid off to do this. Um, Interesting, if you read through the story, you notice that uh, it it seems like God says don't go, but then says you can go. So God allows Balaam to go because he really wanted to go, but Balaam, being a pagan, um, ended up being warned again by God on the way. 3 times the donkey he was on tried to avoid the angel of the Lord that was in the path that Balaam didn't see. Finally, God opens up his eyes to see him, and he starts yelling at the donkey for not moving. But the problem is that the pagans saw gods as local gods over particular areas. So as Balaam was going from where he was over to the plains of Moab to supposedly curse Israel from these mountains in the area of Moab uh, where Balak was, he probably felt as though he would just be dealing with a local god. He had communicated with God where he's at, and then he was now going to a different location. God made it clear to Balaam that he was not just a local god, that he was everywhere. And not only that, we find out when he actually gets there, he goes to 3 different locations. He can't curse them. He can only bless them because of what God puts in his mouth. And even though he is not an Israelite prophet, God speaks through this man, and he utters prophecies of the Messiah's reign that actually confirm what is said in Genesis 49. So, interesting character, interesting story, but again, revealing God's faithfulness and his commitment to Israel. Again, this is the nation that's bringing God's redemptive plan to bless the entire world by bringing the Messiah through Israel. So, Israel falls to Baal worship in chapter 25 and 31. And this is actually from the result of what Balaam did. What Balaam ended up doing, and you can read about it in chapter 31, he went to Balak and said, look, I can't curse these people, but here's what you can do. If you can get these Israelite men sinning with these girls in Moab, show them how to do pagan worship, get them involved in the fornication and their worship rites, which much of the pagan worship was, then he said, look, God will take care of his own people. He'll chastise his own people. He'll take care of them for you. So this was through Balaam's counsel. We learn later on in the book of Revelation that, um, you know, it was a demonic counsel, but yet it worked in the sense that God had to put his hand against his own people. So Israel falls to Baal worship in these chapters. And then finally, in chapter 32, we see Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe Manasseh settle outside the land. They found area before actually entering into the land in these plains of Moab that was good grazing land for their cattle. Basically, they said, look, Moses, this place is good for business for us. We got cattle. This is a great grazing area. Let us stay here. Moses was upset. He said, look, we can't go through this again. We saw what happened with the spies 40 years ago. What are you trying to do? You're going to dishearten all the rest of the people from going into the land. They said, no, 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 look, we'll make a commitment. We will go over into the land and do the battling that we need to do. Our families and our business, our livestock basically will stay here outside the land, and then we will end up coming back after it's all done. So Moses said, that's fine. If you can keep your commitment, that'll be fine. But if you won't, your sin's going to find you out. They ended up doing this. Unfortunately, later on down the line, by the time Jesus Christ came, the tribe of Gad was into pig farming now. Obviously, swine was an animal that was unclean. They weren't supposed to be dealing with it, but this was where Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee to where the tribe of Gad had settled in Gadara, and then this is where the demon-possessed guys come out. The one focused on where he's cutting himself. Jesus ends up casting out the demon called Legion. He's healed in his right mind, and then the people come out of the town and say, please leave. We don't want anything to do with you. You're interfering with our business. Just go away. So this is the result of them. I think staying outside of the land was a mistake. It caused a separation that was not good. And then finally, the last chapters 27 through 36 basically are additional laws and vows in the book of Numbers that we get. So Numbers comes to a close. We have some key points. First of all, Balaam couldn't curse Israel because of Genesis 12:3. Those who bless Israel, God will bless. Those who curse Israel, God will curse. So Balaam was unable to do that. God was keeping his unconditional promise and covenant to Abraham. Important because this is where the Messiah was going to come through this nation to the rest of the world. These wilderness experiences are obviously instructive, not only for the current generation that received them, but for future generations. They needed to understand these are such key examples for people to follow that were Jews at the time, and even for us. There are principles here that are highly instructive for us. God's faithfulness against Israel's rebellion. God constantly was faithful, though Israel continued to fail, seems like at every turn, but yet God's love and faithfulness to them, his commitment to them through the Abrahamic covenant, continued to show that God was not going to change on his end. We see prophets, Isaiah 63, Ezekiel 20, Jeremiah 7, and the apostles. Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 10, and then we see in Hebrews 4 and 5, Psalms 78, 95, and 106. They all refer back to the events in this book to instruct, encourage, and warn. The book of Numbers is great. It's just, as Pastor Randy says here all the time, the Old Testament basically puts flesh on doctrine, and it is highly instructive for us, and that's why even the biblical writers continue to refer back to these stories in Numbers all the time. Third, we learn the consequences of rebellion and unbelief among God's people. This can really deteriorate a group, whether it's in the Old Testament with the Jews and Israel, or whether it's in the New Testament with a church group. Unbelief and rebellion will tear apart any group of God's people. No matter Old Testament or New Testament, the principle still stands. For Christians, we can increase these difficulties in our lives by not willingly yielding our lives to Christ for sanctification. In other words, God wants to conform us into the image of Christ, and as we fight that, we can just make our own life harder as Christians. So we need to yield over, just as the Jews needed to yield to the sanctifying work that God was trying to work through them. And that is basically the book of Numbers. So hopefully it was instructive for you. And May the Lord continue to bless you as you continue to study his word.